Hey everyone, welcome to the show. Have you ever felt like you're constantly chasing some perfect version of yourself? Like always stays just out of reach.
Yeah.
That's what we're going to be diving into today with this memoir, Chasing Peace by Tom Rosshirt.
Okay.
It's a it's a really interesting look at
Hmm.
one man's journey to try to find peace. So make sure to hit that like button,
Yeah.
subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our future deep dives, and you can find a link to the book down in the description below.
You know, what I find really interesting about this memoir is how Rosshirt, he's a speechwriter, right?
Right.
Uses his own personal struggles like addiction and career pressures, even chronic illness, to explore this like universal human desire for peace. And I think what's even more interesting is this connection he makes between neuroscience and spirituality along the way.
Okay, so Rosshert's main argument is that trying to build this perfect self-image is actually what causes us so much suffering.
Yeah.
We're constantly striving, performing, trying to prove ourselves, but in the process, we're disconnecting from who we really are.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes us terrified of being vulnerable.
Yeah, and he illustrates this so well with a story about how he bombed a speech at a
Oh,
spiritual retreat of all places. He was trying so hard to sound profound, impress everybody, but he ended up being totally outshone by people who were just being themselves, speaking from the heart.
I can feel that cringe, you know? Like, it's that pressure we feel to be amazing all the time, but it backfires.
Exactly.
It keeps us from really connecting with people. I mean, haven't we all been there at some point? You know, trying to project this perfect image, but then it just feels phony and exhausting?
Absolutely. And, Rosshirt links this directly to his own struggles with addiction.
Oh, okay.
Alcohol, drugs, workaholism.
Wow.
It all stemmed from this need to suppress uncomfortable feelings and maintain that shiny, positive self-image.
And he talks about this in the context of the shadow self, right?
Yeah,
Like, those parts of ourselves we try to hide because they don't fit the image we want to project to the world?
precisely. It's in those shadows where, like, our deepest fears, insecurities, they just fester.
Right.
And what I found so fascinating was how he ties this back to the work of Johann Hari, who wrote Chasing the Scream. Hari argues that the opposite of addiction is connection, not sobriety. So the more we try to hide those shadow parts of ourselves, the more we isolate ourselves, and we just end up fueling that cycle of addiction.
It's so interesting, though, because Rosshirt, he visits a friend on death row,
Mm-hmm.
and he has this realization that here's a guy in prison convicted of murder, yet he's experiencing real connection, vulnerability with other inmates. And meanwhile, Rosshirt, living this normal life, is struggling with disconnection.
Yeah.
It really makes you think, like, where in our own lives are we seeking connection through this self-image we've created instead of just being vulnerable?
That's the key, isn't it? It's in those moments of vulnerability when we let our guard down and show up as our true selves that we actually create the space for real connection.
But it seems like, for Rosshirt, he doesn't actually have his breakthrough until he has a major breakdown, right?
Yeah, he goes through a period of deep depression and chronic illness. There's this like really striking anecdote where he's visiting a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist looks at his MRI and just says, "The MRI is highly abnormal. Like it's a heavy blow." It forces him to confront the limitations of this self-image he's been clinging to, and he has to give up the illusion of control.
So he's hit rock bottom. What helps him start to heal?
Well, he starts exploring all these different techniques like dynamic neural retraining system, DNRS, emotional awareness and expression therapy, EAE, and internal family systems, IFS. It sounds complicated, but they all emphasize this idea of facing your uncomfortable feelings and challenging the deep-seated beliefs that keep you trapped. Like, it's about turning inward, not looking for external validation.
Okay, let's break those down a bit. What exactly is DNRS and how does it work?
So, DNRS is based on this incredible power of neuroplasticity.
Okay,
The brain's ability to change and rewire itself, even in adulthood.
got it.
The idea is that when we experience, trauma or chronic stress, our limbic system, the part of our brain responsible for the fight or flight response, can get stuck in this state of hypervigilance.
Okay,
So even when we're not in any actual danger, our body's reacting like we are,
interesting.
leading to all sorts of physical and emotional symptoms.
So it's like our internal alarm system is going off constantly, even when there's no fire.
Exactly. And DNRS uses specific techniques to help retrain the limbic system and calm that overactive stress response.
So it's not about willpower. It's about actually working with the brain's ability to adapt.
Yeah, exactly.
That's fascinating. What about eat? How does that approach healing?
EED is all about bringing to the surface and expressing the feelings we've suppressed, often for years. It's based on that same idea that the opposite of addiction is connection. And when we bury difficult emotions, we disconnection ourselves and the people around us. EE gives us a safe and structured way to process those emotions, to actually feel them fully without judging them or resisting them.
That sounds incredibly challenging,
It is.
but also incredibly liberating.
It is. Rosshirt describes having this emotional breakthrough during an eat session. He just cried uncontrollably for hours. He describes it as this turning point, this release. It allowed him to move through a lot of old pain and trauma he'd been carrying around for years.
Wow, that's powerful. So we've got DNRS working with the brain's wiring and EET helping us process and release trapped emotions. What about IFS? How does that fit into all of this?
IFS is interesting because it approaches our inner world as a family system. It's this idea that our psyche is made up of different parts, like subpersonalities, each with its own unique set of needs, desires, motivations.
So like an internal family.
Yeah, like an internal family.
Okay.
You have the inner critic, the inner child, the protector, the rebel.
Oh, okay, I can see that. It's like all these different voices in your head.
Exactly. And often these parts have these conflicting desires, which creates internal conflict and turmoil. So IFS helps us understand and integrate these different parts of ourselves. It's about recognizing that each part has a positive intention, even if its actions are sometimes harmful or self-defeating. Instead of trying to suppress or eliminate those parts, we learn to listen to them with compassion and understanding.
So like creating internal harmony by bringing all those different aspects of ourselves into alignment.
Exactly. And by doing so, we can heal those internal divisions that are causing us so much suffering.
He also explores something called The Work by Byron Katie, and that one seems pretty different from the other techniques we've discussed.
Yeah, it is. It's a more cognitive approach, It's focused on questioning your thoughts, beliefs. It's about challenging those negative thought patterns that keep us stuck in these cycles of fear and self-doubt. Byron Katie's method is surprisingly simple. It involves asking yourself 4 questions about any stressful thought.
Okay, let's hear those 4 questions.
So the first question is it true?
Okay.
Second one is, can you absolutely know that it's true? Third one, how do you react? What happens when you believe that thought? And finally, who would you be without the thought?
Those are some pretty powerful questions. Simple, but powerful.
They really are, and by honestly answering these questions, you can start to see the flaws in your thinking. You can loosen the grip of those negative beliefs that are causing you so much pain. Rosshirt connects this to shadow work. He sees the work as a way of bringing those shadow selves into the light of awareness.
Because by questioning your thoughts, you can understand the underlying fears and insecurities that are driving your behavior, and then work with them constructively.
Exactly, and it's in that process of understanding and acceptance that we can start to integrate those shadow parts and become more whole, more authentically ourselves.
I love that. So it's not about erasing those shadow selves, but about embracing them, learning from them.
Right, and for Rosshirt, the work was a key part of his journey of self-discovery and transformation.
This is also fascinating, but I'm curious, how did these practices actually change him? Did he experience any tangible results?
Oh, he did. He talks about how these practices helped him reduce his anxiety, his depression. He improved his sleep, his energy levels, healed his relationship with food and his body. And most importantly, he found a deeper sense of peace and acceptance, even when he was still going through challenges.
That's a powerful testament to how transformative these techniques can be. But I imagine it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. What works for one person might not work for another.
Absolutely, and Rosshirt emphasizes that. He encourages readers to experiment, find what resonates with them, approach this journey of healing with curiosity and openness. And remember, it's an ongoing process, not a destination. It's about showing up for yourself with compassion and commitment every single day.
Beautifully said. I think that's a great place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. We'll be back in part 2 to explore even more of Rossshirt's journey and how he applied these practices in his own life. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into chasing peace.
We're picking up where we left off, exploring some of those powerful techniques that Tom Rosshirt used on his journey toward inner peace.
Yeah, this time we're getting practical. How do we actually break free from that self-image trap?
Yeah, because it's one thing to understand the problem intellectually, but it's another to actually change those deep-seated patterns.
Exactly, and that's what I think is so great about Rosshart's approach. He doesn't just diagnose the problem. He really rolls up his sleeves and starts experimenting with this whole range of solutions, from ancient spiritual practices to like cutting-edge neuroscience.
Which makes sense given his background. He's a speechwriter, but he's also deeply into spirituality. So he's comfortable bridging those two worlds.
Absolutely. So let's dive into some of those techniques. One that really stood out to me was dynamic neural retraining system, or DNRS, as it's often called.
Right. He talked about how that was a real game changer for him. Can you give us a quick rundown of what DNRS is all about?
Sure, DNRS was developed by Annie Hopper, who had her own incredible healing journey. She suffered from this severe case of chemical sensitivities where even everyday, like scents or products, would trigger these debilitating symptoms.
Yeah, I remember him mentioning that. It was so bad she had to live in a tent for a while.
It was a really extreme situation, but through her process of trial and error, she figured out how to retrain her brain and actually seal. And that's what led her to create DNRS to help other people do the same.
So what's the basic premise of DNRS? Like, how does it actually work?
Well, it's based on the incredible power of neuroplasticity. That's the brain's ability to change and rewire itself, even in adulthood. The idea is that when we experience trauma or chronic stress, our limbic system, that's the part of the brain that governs our fight or flight response, it can get stuck in overdrive.
Oh, okay. So it's like our internal alarm system is constantly going off, even when there's no real danger.
Precisely. And this can manifest in all sorts of physical and emotional symptoms, anxiety, chronic fatigue, pain, digestive issues, you name it.
Which is exactly what happened with Annie Hopper. Her limbic system was so sensitive that even harmless substances were triggering this massive stress response.
Exactly. So DNRS uses these specific techniques to help calm down that overactive limbic system and retrain the brain to respond more appropriately to stimuli. And one of the key techniques is something called conscious awareness. It involves bringing your attention to the present moment and noticing the sensations in your body without judgment.
Okay, that sounds a lot like mindfulness, which we know has all sorts of benefits for mental and physical health.
Yeah, it is similar. But DNRS kind of takes it a step further by incorporating visualizations and positive affirmations that help to create new neural pathways in the brain. It's about consciously shifting your focus away from that fear and towards a sense of safety and well-being.
So instead of trying to fight or suppress those symptoms, you're actually working with your brain to change its underlying response.
Exactly. And Rosshirt found this to be incredibly helpful. He was able to overcome his fear of certain foods and environments that used to trigger his anxiety. He would gradually expose himself to those triggers in small doses, while at the same time focusing on positive memories and emotions.
So he was basically retraining his brain to associate those triggers with safety rather than danger.
Precisely. It's amazing how powerful our minds are when we understand how to work with them.
Absolutely. And it's important to note, this isn't some kind of quick fix. It takes time and consistent effort to rewire those neural pathways.
Right. But the results can be truly life-changing, as Rosshert's story shows.
Okay, that's DNRS. He also talks about emotional awareness and expression therapy, or EAE.
Right. This approach is all about bringing to the surface and expressing those feelings we've suppressed, often for years or even decades.
And he connects this back to the idea that the opposite of addiction is connection, which we talked about earlier.
Exactly. When we bury those difficult emotions, we're essentially cutting ourselves off from a part of ourselves. And that disconnection can lead to all sorts of unhealthy coping mechanisms, including addiction.
So EE helps us to bridge that gap, to reconnect with our full range of emotions, even the messy, uncomfortable ones.
Yes, it's about learning to feel our feelings fully without judgment or resistance, which can be incredibly challenging for a lot of us.
Especially in a culture that often tells us to toughen up and to just get over it.
It's true, we're often conditioned to believe that negative emotions are bad or weak, but the paradox is that the more we try to avoid them, the more power they have over us.
So EE gives us a safe and structured way to process those emotions, to actually feel them, move through them, and release them.
Exactly, and it's often done with the help of a therapist who can guide you through that process and create a safe container for those big feelings to emerge.
Yeah, because it could be pretty intense work to confront those deep-seated emotions.
It can be. Rosshirt talks about having this emotional breakthrough during an EE session where he just started crying uncontrollably, and he couldn't stop for hours.
And he describes that as like a real turning point in his healing journey, a real release.
He does. It's like all that pent-up emotional energy finally had a way to move through him.
It's interesting how he connects EE to some of the spiritual practices he's explored, like Vipassana meditation. He talks about how meditation can be helpful in calming the mind, but it doesn't necessarily address those deeper emotional wounds.
Right, meditation can help us to become more aware of our thoughts and emotions, but it doesn't always give us the tools to actually process and release them. And that's where EE comes in. It helps us to excavate those buried emotions and bring them into the light of awareness where they can finally be healed.
Okay, so we've got DNRS rewiring the brain's stress response, and EET helping us process and release those stuck emotions. What about internal family systems, or IFS? How does that fit into the picture?
IFS is this fascinating approach that views the psyche as a kind of internal family system. The idea is that we all have these different parts or subpersonalities within us, each with its own unique set of needs, desires, and motivations.
So it's like we're all carrying around this whole cast of characters inside.
Exactly. You have the inner critic, the inner child, the protector, the rebel, and so on. And these parts often have conflicting desires, which can create a lot of inner turmoil and conflict.
Oh, I can definitely relate to that. Sometimes it feels like there's this whole committee in my head arguing about what to do.
Yeah, and that's where IFS comes in. It helps us to understand and integrate these different parts of ourselves. It's about recognizing that each part has a positive intention, even if its actions are sometimes harmful or self-defeating.
So instead of trying to silence or get rid of those parts, which is what a lot of us try to do,
Right. We learn to listen to them with compassion and curiosity to understand what they're trying to tell us. And by doing so, we can start to heal those internal rifts and create a more harmonious inner world.
so it's like becoming the wise and compassionate leader of our own internal family.
I love that analogy. That's exactly what it's about. And it can be incredibly transformative to learn how to work with these different parts of ourselves.
He also talks about The Work by Byron Katie, which seems to take a more cognitive approach to challenging those unhelpful thought patterns.
Yes, the work is all about questioning those beliefs and assumptions that are causing us stress and suffering. And Katie's method is surprisingly simple, yet very powerful. It involves asking yourself 4 key questions about any stressful thought that arises.
Can you walk us through those 4 questions?
Of course, the first question is it true? Just pause and really consider whether the thought you're having is actually true or just a story you're telling yourself. The second question is, can you absolutely know that it's true? This one really challenges us to examine the evidence for our beliefs.
Because so often we're operating on assumptions and beliefs that we haven't really examined.
Exactly. The third question is, how do you react? What happens when you believe that thought? This helps us to see the impact our thoughts are having on our emotions and behaviors. And the final question is, who will you be without the thought? This one's so powerful because it invites us to imagine a different way of being. What if we weren't burdened by that limiting belief?
Those questions really get you thinking. It's amazing how such a simple process can be so profound.
It really is. And Rosshirt connects the work to shadow work as well. He sees it as a way of bringing those hidden parts of ourselves into the light of awareness so we can integrate them and become more whole.
So it's not about erasing those shadow parts, but about understanding and accepting them.
Exactly. And it's through that acceptance that we can finally find peace with ourselves.
All of these techniques are so fascinating, but I'm curious, did Rosshirt actually experience any tangible results from these practices?
He did. He talks about how these practices helped him to reduce his anxiety and depression, improve his sleep and his energy levels, heal his relationship with food and his body, and most importantly, find a deeper sense of peace and acceptance, even in the face of ongoing challenges.
That's really inspiring. It shows that real transformation is possible, even if we've been struggling for a long time.
It does. And I think it's important to remember that Rosshirt doesn't present these techniques as like a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right. What works for one person might not work for another. It's about finding what resonates with you and your own unique journey.
Exactly. He encourages readers to approach healing with a sense of curiosity and openness, to experiment with different approaches and see what clicks.
It's a reminder that we're all on our own unique paths, and there's no right or wrong way to go about this.
And that's a great place to wrap up this part of our deep dive.
Yes, we've covered a lot of ground exploring some of the powerful techniques that Rosshirt used to heal and transform, but his journey goes even deeper than that.
It does. In part 3, we'll delve into the philosophical and spiritual insights that emerged from his experience, so stay tuned for that.
Welcome back to our deep dive into chasing peace.
We're in the final stretch of our exploration of Tom Rosshart's journey.
Yeah, and in this part, we're shifting gears a bit. We've talked about all the practical tools, the techniques he used to heal and transform.
Right.
But his story goes so much deeper than that. Like, it delves into some pretty profound philosophical and spiritual questions.
It does. It really grapples with, like, the nature of self, the meaning of life, even the possibility of transcending suffering altogether.
Big questions. And what I find so compelling is how he weaves these big questions into his very personal story.
Yeah.
So let's dive into some of those deeper themes. One that really struck me was this idea of the self-image as a crap.
Mm-hmm.
He argues that we often create these idealized versions of ourselves, these carefully curated personas that we present to the world.
Yeah.
And then we become so attached to those images that we're constantly trying to protect them. Like, we don't want them to be tarnished.
Exactly. And that creates so much anxiety
Right.
and suffering. We're always afraid of being exposed as frauds.
Yeah.
We're not living up to our own impossible standards.
It's like building a life on this really shaky foundation of self-doubt and insecurity.
And that fear can drive us to make choices that aren't truly aligned with our values.
Right.
We might stay in a job we hate or a relationship that's no longer serving us,
Right.
all because we're trying to preserve that perfect image.
So how do we break free from this trap? How do we let go of this need to present this, like, flawless facade to the world?
Well, Rosshirt suggests that self-compassion is key.
Okay.
It's about learning to accept ourselves, warts and all.
To embrace our imperfections. Like, as part of what makes us unique, makes us human.
Exactly, and to recognize that those imperfections are often the source of our greatest strengths and creativity.
It's such a powerful shift in perspective. Instead of seeing our flaws as something to hide, we can start to appreciate them as, like, part of this rich tapestry of who we are.
Yeah, and that's where true freedom and peace lie. Not in achieving some idealized version of ourselves, but in embracing who we already are.
He also talks about the importance of questioning our thoughts and beliefs, like not just accepting them at face value, but really examining whether they're actually serving us.
Right. He draws on the work of Byron Katie and her method of inquiry, which is called the work. It's about challenging those negative thought patterns that keep us stuck in these cycles of fear and self-doubt.
Those automatic thoughts that can, like, run on a loop in our minds,
Yeah.
creating so much unnecessary suffering.
Exactly. And Katie's approach is so simple, but it's incredibly powerful. It's about asking ourselves, is this thought really true? Can I absolutely know that it's true? How do I react when I believe this thought? And who would I be without this thought?
Yeah, just causing to ask those questions can create so much space for insight and transformation.
It can, because it helps us see that our thoughts aren't facts. They're just stories that we're telling ourselves. And we actually have the power to choose which stories we want to believe.
Of course, he ties this back to the shadow self, that part of ourselves that we tend to deny or repress.
Yeah. He sees the shadow not as something to be feared, but as an actual source of wisdom and creativity.
It's where our deepest fears and desires reside, like the parts of ourselves that we've deemed unacceptable.
Right. And by bringing those shadow aspects into the light of awareness, we can begin to integrate them into our whole selves.
It's about recognizing that we are not just the light, but also the darkness, and that embracing both is what makes us fully human.
Exactly. And in that process of integration, we can find true healing and wholeness.
Another theme that really resonated with me was the importance of vulnerability.
Yeah. He argues that vulnerability is not a weakness, but a strength. It's the foundation of real connection, intimacy.
It's about letting down our guard and allowing ourselves to be seen for who we truly are, even the messy, imperfect parts.
Yeah, and that can be scary, but it's also incredibly liberating. Because when we're willing to be vulnerable, we create space for trust and empathy to flourish.
And that's where real transformation can happen, both individually and collectively.
Absolutely. He even suggests that vulnerability is the key to unlocking our creativity. Because when we're not afraid to be seen, we can express ourselves more authentically, powerfully.
That's so true. It's like when we're trying to hide or protect ourselves, our creative energy gets stifled. But when we open up and allow ourselves to be vulnerable, our true voice can finally emerge.
Right, and that's such a gift to the world. The more we embrace our own unique voices, the more we contribute to a richer, more diverse human experience.
And then he takes this even further and starts talking about the possibility of, like, transcending suffering altogether.
Yeah, that's a bold statement.
It is. What's his take on that?
Well, he draws on a variety of spiritual traditions like Buddhism, Christianity, which teach that suffering is ultimately an illusion.
An illusion in what sense?
Well, it's not that pain and hardship don't exist, but that our suffering arises from our attachment to the self and to the things of this world.
So it's our clinging, our grasping, that actually creates the suffering.
Exactly. And by letting go of those attachments, we can experience this profound sense of liberation and joy, even in the face of really difficult circumstances.
It's about recognizing that we are not our thoughts. We are not our emotions. We are something much vaster and more enduring than that.
Yeah. He uses the word grace to describe this state of being.
Mm-hmm.
And he sees grace as this ever-present force that's available to us all, regardless of our beliefs or circumstances.
It's a beautiful concept, but it can feel a bit abstract, hard to grasp sometimes.
I agree. But Rossshirt's own story offers a really tangible example of how grace can operate in our lives. He talks about his experience with his mother's death.
Yes, it's such a powerful and moving account of how love and compassion can, triumph over fear and grief.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that even in those really dark times, there's always the possibility of finding light and hope.
And that's ultimately what Chasing Peace is all about. It's a message of hope, of resilience, a reminder that true peace doesn't come from achieving some external goal, but from an inner transformation.
Right. It's about letting go of the chase and embracing the present moment with all its imperfections.
It's been such a rich and rewarding deep dive. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this book.
I agree. There's so much to unpack here.
So we really encourage you to check out Chasing Peace for yourself. The link is down in the description below. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you most from our discussion? Share your insights in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Until next time.